Hi, this is Martin Fowler, and you're listening to the Agile Uprising.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the Agile Uprising podcast. I'm your host, Troy Lightfoot, and with me I have Dave Feldman. Hello, Dave.
Hello, Troy. How are you?
I am well, and today we are going to have what I would consider a pretty out-of-the-box episode of the Agile Uprising podcast. Normally we talk about process stuff, product stuff, some technical stuff, but we don't really get into either nutrition or biohacking or a lot of other types of things. So I've had one biohacking episode before. My guest was Seamland, who was a YouTuber. And that went over pretty well. I got a lot of good feedback. So I wanted to come up with something maybe even more outside of the box than that one. But I think because you are a software engineer, this could be a beautiful melding between, I think people find this very interesting. So I'm not going to give your intro. I'm going to ask you to give your intro. So Dave, if you can give me a little bit about yourself, your backgrounds, feel free.
Well, it's kind of not easy to put in an elevator pitch, but here's my best shot at it.
Okay.
I've been writing code. I think I wrote my first line of code when I was 13. Mm-hmm. So this will give you a sense of my age. It had been over 30 years.
Okay.
And I've loved software engineering my whole life. I've loved the concept of engineering, really. Right. And it was always something that even when I had other main jobs working my way through college, it was always something I was just doing. Like almost every night I would be in front of the computer seeing what I could make happen, either in a game or an app or what have you. Mm-hmm. And as with most software engineers, eventually I worked my way into the entrepreneurial space and have been fortunate to find good partners over time. My last business partner is still one of my best friends, love him to death. And we had a great startup, the most successful startup that I'd had up to that point. And one of the things that excited me about doing this podcast with you was, just like many other people, I found that the process by which engineers come together and make software is hugely important. Mm-hmm. It really makes or breaks businesses.
Right.
And one of the catches with using a process that works is that you have to recognize where you're doing things that aren't really intuitive. Mm-hmm. Because the things we imagine we can make happen are oftentimes way out of scope.
Right.
So a good example is even from the youngest age, the moment I learned some code, I could imagine much bigger systems that I would be eventually making and building and churning out than would ever really happen.
Right.
And anybody listening now who's ever written any lines of code, who's ever gotten excited about programming knows exactly what I'm talking about, because I think almost all of us have at least 9 totally unfinished projects for every 10th project we've completed. And that's probably liberal. Like it's probably many, many more than that.
Right.
Well, so what if you really do try to make a company that's based on delivering on these things?
Right.
Well, then you start really caring about how it is that you can meet the expectations of what you figure out. And that's where process comes into play. And so when you reached out to me and you were talking about having an Agile podcast, and I hadn't known about it before, and you're talking about how it relates back to what I'm doing now, I got quite excited. So
okay,
now I'll move into where I'm at now. Now I write less code than I ever have in my whole life.
Right.
The reason is because I've been doing enormous amounts of biohacking.
Okay.
So here's what happened.
Right.
I left that great successful company. Actually, a better way of putting it is we got bought out and turned into a department inside of a larger company that was our biggest client. Then my partner and I eventually left and we kind of did our own thing. And I wanted to make games for a while. I was just going to take a sabbatical and for 2 years make games, knowing that game development, especially in the mobile app space, is hugely saturated and it probably wouldn't be that successful. But it was kind of like a long break, if you will.
Sure.
About halfway into that, I had started a ketogenic diet, which is a low carb, high fat diet.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd mainly done it to dodge type 2 diabetes. My dad's side of the family has type 2 diabetes all over the place. And I had a marker for pre-diabetes
Right.
that I responded to. And I said, okay, well, I'm going to see what I'm finding on diabetic forums people are doing to get out of it. And basically you just take away the carbohydrates. Carbohydrates bring up the insulin, they bring up the glucose. Down the road, you have type 2 diabetes.
Right.
So I went on it, and actually a whole bunch of things improved in my life. I lost a lot of weight, even though I wasn't meaning to. I felt better than I ever did before. I was setting personal records with my running at the time I was training for half marathon. And everything was looking swimmingly until about 7 months in, I get my cholesterol numbers back.
Oh boy. All right.
Yeah. Shot through the roof.
Right.
My cholesterol was sky high at, I want to say it was 329 was my total cholesterol.
Mm-hmm.
When before that point, it was maybe 180, something like that.
Okay.
But it effectively doubled.
Right.
And I then went, I need to learn everything I can about cholesterol and just find out if I need to just abandon this diet, even though I love this diet.
Right.
And as I started learning about cholesterol, in particular, the field of lipidology, it's the, lipids themselves.
Mm-hmm.
I found out that system that moves it around in your body
Right.
is like a network.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
So let me set it up, because what I love is a lot of people who listen to you will appreciate this.
Okay. Hopefully we'll see. We'll see.
See, cholesterol in your blood is actually carried by something. It's carried by a lipid carrying protein, otherwise known as a lipoprotein. So when you hear LDL cholesterol, the so-called bad cholesterol,
Right.
that's low density lipoprotein. That's what the last L means, lipoprotein. As in, the cholesterol is cargo that is inside that lipoprotein. It's like a boat.
Mm-hmm.
So your body, in order to make cholesterol bioavailable to your cells, makes this boat, puts the cholesterol in it and sends it into your bloodstream so it's soluble and it'll move around in your bloodstream just fine. Right. But here's the other important part of the story. Those lipoproteins also have a whole bunch of other lipids in them. So not just cholesterol, they also have triglycerides, which is a stored form of fat-based energy, and things like fat-soluble vitamins like A, D, E, and K.
Right.
And it packages all of these into the same boat. So it's just a multi-cargo boat, right?
Right.
And then it turned out there was something else that was a very familiar pattern to me. It's on the outside of these boats is this snaky-like proteins called apolipoproteins, sometimes just called APOs.
Right.
They are like headers.
Okay.
They based on what is on them, it says what it is cells can use them for. Let me give you an example.
Mm-hmm.
When one of these things launches out of either the liver or the gut, and it's bloated up with triglycerides, which is that fat-based energy, well, what'll get assigned to it is this ApoC2.
Okay.
And an ApoC2 basically means it's ready to deliver some of that fat-based energy to the tissues. It says, hey, I've got stuff on board. It's almost like it's an open sign, right? Open for food.
Right.
And so what happens is there's a special receptor on cells that specifically, it's like almost think of it like a fishing line that specifically only binds to ApoC2.
Okay.
So that when it attaches, a chemical process, I've already talked a lot of biochemistry, so I'm not going to go into all of this, but a chemical process initiates where that cargo, that fat-based energy will now seep into the cell, and the cell now gets fed some fat-based energy.
Right.
Right?
Yes.
And that, at that point, I was hooked. I was like, oh, lipidology is also like networking. I want to learn everything about all of these different APOs. I want to understand how this whole management system is in play. And not to, I describe it this way all the time, even though we're using it in a different context. I constantly called it Agile.
Okay.
It's a very agile system, right?
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. So what then follows is a bit more of an involved story, but the bottom line is I learned by myself doing high frequency testing, getting my blood taken a lot, that actually I could manipulate my cholesterol numbers substantially.
Okay.
And I could do it by changing just my diet. That basically the primary purpose for lipoproteins, and not the only purpose, but the primary purpose is as an energy distribution system. It's to distribute those triglycerides.
Right.
And cholesterol is just along for the ride. It's in those boats along with it. So I started learning how it is that I could modify it and change it around. Now, here's the part that's going to be pretty relevant to your audience and to you, which is I come from the same world you do. We're in technology.
Right.
In technology, virtually every engineer is at their core a skeptic, right?
Yeah.
Some more than others.
Yeah.
But if you had Bill Gates walk into a meeting with a whole bunch of junior engineers and he just said something completely ridiculous, you would have junior engineers calling him out on that, right?
For sure.
Like that's standard in our culture.
Right.
This is just absolutely the way it is. We can't wait to catch each other being wrong about things.
Right.
And so this whole time, I thought that was the same thing with medicine. I thought that on the other side, in research especially, that there would be constant, very discerning, very critical eyes on everything. And what I came to find out, and really this was a lot that was told to me by a lot of undergrads in this, is that no, actually it's very hierarchical. You don't want to upset the professor who's looking to possibly add you to the team that's about to do this clinical trial.
Right. Yep.
So you're very careful with the way that you say things. I thought when I had this research in hand and I was showing this very first pattern, this inversion pattern that I was coming up with, that sure enough, that would just be snatched out of my hands by other better PhD researchers that would be like, this is great, Dave. This is fantastic. Let me get this straight. If you eat a whole lot of fat while on a ketogenic diet, you can make your cholesterol go down in a predictable fashion. Yes. And conversely, if I don't eat a lot of fat, but I'm fat adapted, my cholesterol will go up. That's what I call the inversion pattern. That was the first part of my research, right? That this would be just immediately seized on, I naively thought.
Yeah. Because
it was something that I didn't find frequently in the literature and I thought would be quickly adopted. Nothing could be further from the truth. A lot of other people were very interested in the research eventually. And frankly, the toughest people I have to get across to are lipidologists. So that's a bit to unpack, but yeah, that's why now pretty much 24/7, I'm working on this research and trying to get this whole energy model understood both in the literature and in the community of low carbers in particular.
Yeah. So let me just stop you there because that's a great intro to everything. So for the audience listening out there who's not familiar with Dave, let's just talk about, I'm just going to mention your website. It's cholesterolcode.com. And I'll probably mention it a few times and I'll put it in the show notes. This is a personal opinion, and some folks in the audience who are listening, they know me as an outside of the box thinker, maybe. And that's why I get reached out to a lot, especially if I show up to work and somebody will mention something to me I said on a podcast 6 months ago, and they'll be like, you know what, like, I never thought about it that way, but that's pretty interesting. And I'll be like, I don't even know what you're talking about. But anyway, I try to always think outside of the box. So I get really excited when we have people who are also outside of the box thinkers who challenge the norms, who try to come up with new ways of doing things. So for the listening audience out there, I kind of think about Dave as I'm almost like I'm interviewing Kent Beck in 1997. So for those who are familiar with who Kent Beck is, basically Kent Beck is one of the creators of extreme programming and one of the founders of Agile. So a lot of our modern engineering practices like continuous integration and test-driven development and unit testing and all these things, Kent was kind of the one of the pioneers of those things. And ever since then, and his involvement in the Agile Manifesto creation, it's like the world was one way and everything was done in silos. And then after his influence and his kind of uprising, and obviously the other manifesto authors too, but Ken is just kind of one of the Mount Rushmore figures, put it that way. So I'm almost like, so that I got kind of geeked up because I said, I feel like Dave is the guy that 20 years from now, we're going to be looking at like, oh, that's the Kent Beck of nutrition. Okay. Actually, yeah, that's kind of like blowing smoke up your rear end, but it is true. Like I do feel that. That's why I was very passionate about trying to get you on here. And I pinged you quite a few times. So I was trying to really, I was like, I know he's a busy guy, but I got to get like this other world is going on and I got to let people know about it and how it's related to what we do and how it's similar. So, all right. So you have been a software engineer most of your life since you were a pretty young age. You developed this pattern in lipidology through a software development pattern, inversion pattern. And now it's kind of getting harder and harder, I think, for people to ignore this information. The more and more it starts to make sense to people, right, as you see it.
Right.
And I'm just kind of recapping what you said. And you have the old guard, essentially the hierarchical structure who's put in place to, I don't know if nefarious is the right word, but at least that there is a structure put in place that's really, really hard to change, right? So it's hard to kind of turn the ship around. This is this huge ship, right? And you can come along and you can be making suggestions about how to turn it around. But in order to get that whole ship turned around, it could take years, right? Decades. Who knows, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So it is a huge undertaking for sure. It's not like a basic scientific premise where you can just say, hey, I've disproven this thing, or at least in my work, because why don't you take a look at this too? Because people might not even be financially vested in taking a look at it. That's a simple thing, right? So there's a lot of other reasons too, of course. So let's get into the agenda here. So I'm going to compare briefly how a correlation between the history of Agile and what I think is going on in current nutritional science, and you being kind of I think one of the kind of leaders in that. So for you and for the audience who's listening, because not everyone is familiar with the entire history of it. So essentially, there was a group. So the most popular and pretty much the only way that majority of people did software development was in this process called waterfall. I shouldn't say only, but pretty much that's how everyone did it. And that is a project-based, resource-based way of working, where you have an idea, you have to come up with all the documentation first, all the designs first, and then you go do all the development, and then you do all the testing, and then you find all the bugs, and then you do all the development again, if you're lucky. And then after 2 years, you put something out, and then you find more bugs, right? And then by that point, probably people don't even use half the stuff that's in it, or maybe your competitor has beaten you to it. So that is essentially the process that has been used for a long time. It was the only pretty much way of working for most people. So it's not like there was a better way or a new way. It's just that some people succeeded with it and some people didn't. So there was another group of people who were working in different ways, and they were coming up with their own ways. And they might have been borrowing ideas from lean manufacturing. They might have been borrowing ideas from double entry bookkeeping, which was the idea of double entry bookkeeping and accounting is what was the influence on creating test-driven development, actually. So there's this all these influences that these people had, and 17 of them got together in 2001, and they said with the idea that we've all been working differently, contrary to the way that the mass, everybody else works, right? We are outside of the box thinkers. We have new ways of doing things. What are the things that we all kind of agree on? What are the principles and values that we agree on that we can kind of set a new way of working for the world, essentially? And I don't think at the time they realized how big of a change it would make. They just wanted to help out the companies they're working at and software engineers. So that's kind of the background. They created this thing, put it out there, and over time, it just kind of caught on, especially at startups. It became more popular. And then, once the startups kind of kicking some of the bigger companies' butts, right? And they said, well, we got to become more like startups. We have to be able to maneuver quickly and be agile, right? So we got to start adopting these things. And eventually, there's this term called crossing the chasm, which comes from a book called Jeffrey Moore, which is basically like, if you think about from product development, you have your very early adopters who are totally bought into you and what you do, right? So you have this concept of like, so let's say that people that will want to be part of Apple's new iOS beta test, right? Those are your very early adopters, people that don't care about dealing with bugs and things like that. And then people that get geeked out. But eventually, there's this chasm from early adopters to mainstream success. And that chasm is pretty difficult to cross, and a lot of people never cross it. So Agile eventually crossed the chasm and actually became the mainstream. So what was once considered outside of the box thinking is now starting to become the box almost.
Right.
That makes sense. So I feel like, and actually the first sentence of the Agile Manifesto is we are uncovering better ways of developing software by doing it and helping others do it. And what they mean by that is they haven't found the best way. The principle is that we're always going to be looking for better ways. We're always going to be trying to disprove ourselves, actually, and trying to figure out a new and better way to do things, that there's no such thing as necessarily a best practice, right? So comparing that to what you have going on and what the current state of nutrition and nutritional science, I feel like we're kind of like at the 90s, pre-2001 Agile, where you have all these different people coming up with contrary ways to the way people do things, right? So the popular opinion is that, if you have high cholesterol, you're going to get a heart attack. And if you eat saturated fat, you're going to get a heart attack. There's all these very standard things that most people think. Also that you're supposed to eat basically mostly all vegetables, that red meat is bad for you. There's a lot of very standardized thinking that if you went if at work and asked people about that, 9 out of 10 people would probably say, yeah, that's true, because that's just what people are told and what people believe, right? Fair enough. So there's these pockets of other people, though, that are kind of doing things that are starting to anecdotally disprove that, and actually in some clinical trials disprove that. So that's going to lend itself to me talking to you, Dave, about maybe you could give me your perspective on what you see now that I've kind of given that parallel of where Agile was in the 90s, the actual creation of these things from people who got together. It would almost be like you, Sean Baker, I don't know, I'm just throwing names out there, but a bunch of different people coming together, Gary Tobbs, and like writing some manifesto that like would kick off. It's essentially that concept, we're kind of like pre-manifesto in that way, right? So
I'm kind of writing something. So I have a book that I'm working on right now, and that's a chapter in and of itself. But I feel like it could become its own book.
Okay.
But let's really get under the surface of this, because the parallels are striking.
Yeah.
You mentioned waterfall. You mentioned lean. There's going to be some number of people who are listening to this who aren't that familiar with the process, but you did kind of go over it. What I want to say, all you really need to know is waterfall on paper looks the best. Yeah. Like if somebody never had any experience at all with software development, and I were to lay out both of those, and I were to say, would you like to choose this process, waterfall, or would you like to choose this other process, lean? They would go, wow, waterfall makes complete sense. Right. Lean looks like it's chaos. Right. Like it looks like there's just a whole lot of uncertainty and unrest. It looks like there's a lot of chances for things to go awry and break, right? Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Whereas waterfall sounds it sounds very, things are figured out at the top. Things are well planned. They're documented. How great is it that you completely document how the software is going to work, and everyone signs off on it, and then you get to a final transition phase. And the reason I'm emphasizing this, as you all know, is we first did that a lot.
Right.
We did a lot. And then I don't know about you, I've yet to ever one time ever see a waterfall. And I'm not even talking about in teams that I've hired or have been a part of. I'm talking in any software company I've ever seen. I've never seen a true full-blown waterfall process meet full completion ever, not once. It's usually some kind of start to a process that eventually unravels and turns into some hybrid of something else, right?
Yeah.
And that's because that's not how humans work. Humans think that they know what they want in a complex way. We think we can imagine the software we're going to make, even if we've been thinking about it for 10 years, but we haven't written any code yet. We think we know it inside and out. We've been imagining it for so long, right?
Right.
And that's kind of our bane as humans. That doesn't just apply to programming. That applies to all kinds of advanced concepts. So that's why you do things like drills. That's why if a situation occurs and you may think it's a simple situation, you can discover that it's not a simple situation. I chatted with a friend recently who was into free solo, I think it's called.
Okay.
Basically, he climbs without a rope, which I think is just completely insane. And he said, actually, it's not. It's way safer than you think it is. It's just the consequences are extremely high if you make a fatal mistake. So you really do a lot of planning and a whole bunch of other stuff. But it's actually, and he took me through a lot of stuff I'm not going to go into here, but he took me through a lot of the different considerations, how he plans his routes very carefully, how there's all sorts of thought put into just lots of things that he never, ever, ever imagined when he was doing his very first climb, right? Because what's happening, you're actually learning with experience along the way. That's the human process.
Right.
You want to think that there's not much more to this rugged wall than general principles of how you climb. And that's why I find, and I've talked about this with engineers several times over, I'm sure you can appreciate this as well. Even 30 years later, I'm still impressed at how much I can underestimate the scope of work that's involved with anything I've ever programmed, no matter how many times I've done it. It really is like Lucy and the football with Charlie Brown.
Yeah.
It's amazing, and it's because deep down we just have more confidence in our ability to know and to imagine in a complex way.
Right.
And we just don't. We don't.
Right.
Okay. Now, let's take a step back again. What if I described to you 50 years ago that there would be this future where, guess what? The government has figured out our nutritional needs.
Right.
They've actually created guidelines that brought together the greatest experts in the world to help formulate so that people could know properly what it is that they need to consume for the best possible health outcome, right?
Right.
I'll bet you the majority of people would be like, wow, that sounds great. Probably that future has greater longevity. People are probably thinner and exercising more. Things are just better, right?
Yeah.
Because it's easy to imagine. Yeah. It makes it even easier when you say, hey, there's actually even these institutions that are helping to curate this data for us, to really keep an eye on it. So you've got, like, say, the American Heart Association. They are on top of what it is we need to know to best avoid heart disease, right? We have, Diabetes Association. We have all these different associations, and they're all helping out to keep this knowledge best distilled down to you as the potential user of that information. Right. It sounds great. It's waterfall to me.
Okay. All right.
And this is where I got lucky. I got lucky because I came into this in 2015, and we have the internet, and we have social media. And so I was basically able to take the principles of lean to research. I was able to say, you know what? I'm not going to practice a hierarchical system. I'm going to practice a very flat one. And I'm going to entreat upon people to to share back data. How am I going to do that? Because I'm sharing data with them.
Right.
And I'm not going to treat this as a project that can only have one outcome, which is the one that I imagine it to be.
Yep.
I'm instead going to say, I am in the process of figuring it out. This is what experiment I was able to do. I'd be curious if you guys could do the same thing. I'd be interested. And so I lay out and be as transparent as I can about every part of the process. So I'm anti-silo, right?
Yep.
Silos, for people who are listening to this that are a little more on the medical side of the camp. Silos are what we call it in programming, where you end up having, these large scale departments. So you have like an art department, and you have a server department, and you have a client department. And what happens when you make these departments? Well, in your head, you think this is great. They can specialize in their respective services, and then they can provide those services like, internal B2B customers, right?
Right.
No, that's not what happens.
Right.
You find out that actually you're better off embedding a designer in a small team with another server guy and another client guy for them to build an app, their piece of the app, right? Because that's actually how you limit the amount of conflict that comes into play. You limit more of that tribalism that occurs. But on top of that, you keep very rapid fire conversations going on the true technical outcomes of the decisions that need to be made today.
Right.
And so you don't have like emails that lingered for days or weeks, and then, that turned out to be middle management's problem, Ted, blah, blah, blah. Well, you didn't copy so-and-so, and such and such was out of town. I mean, these sorts of things only happen when you have large scale organizations, right?
Right.
Well, how do you deal with that at a research level? As it turns out, at the research level, I'm seeing these same problems. I'm seeing the version of departments that are built up in these large scale companies is basically what these organizations are that I'm talking about. I'm not going to go into the American Heart Association right now and find somebody like me. There's not going to be somebody who's like, I am a little skeptical on the lipid hypothesis, and I want to explore ways in which we may not have gotten the full story right, guys.
Yeah.
No, on the contrary, they coalesce around a particular position that gets them to release the presidential advisory, which they did, I want to say 2 years ago, 1 year ago. I'm not sure. That basically declares that saturated fat is killing us, right?
Right.
And that to me is where the parallels are striking. They're so striking, and really information technology, I think, is going to save us in medical science. Because
that is the quote of the podcast. Okay, right there. Yeah. Yes. Okay, go ahead. Explain. Go ahead.
No. Look, it's if we didn't have it, if we didn't have that capability to circumvent and try to determine this research on our own. And look, I really want to emphasize this. Both areas have their place. I do think that there's a lot of value for like a properly executed double-blind placebo-controlled trial. 100%, right? But there's also a problem if only certain actors have the means to execute those. And therefore, if we only get data from that side of the fence, from like industry studies or from those on the bureaucratic side, but who tend to be the kingmakers, we're stuck in that there's not really a lot of ability for people to determine science for themselves, right? Well, now the game has changed, and particularly in the area of cholesterol, I think, because we now have this cohort that's coming up. And let me actually get into hyper-responders real quick to kind of set this up a little bit better for your audience.
Sure, please.
For those people who are on a ketogenic diet, or for that matter, even a low-carb diet, it's not uncommon to see your cholesterol go up, as mine had 3 years and a few months ago. And when that happens, my energy model suggests what it is as to the reason why. But I don't want to spend a lot of the podcast talking about that. You can see the lectures at cholesterolcode.com where I talk it out. What I'm wanting to drill into here is that hyper-responders was the beginning of my research, in that I found out I was one, could then start reaching out to others on the internet about it. I didn't have to go to my doctor, who had never known of hyper-responders before I was talking about it. I didn't have to go to another state. I didn't have to go to some specialist who might only just have their own human knowledge about it. I could go online.
Right.
I could go to forums. I could make a post. That post could say keywords, my LDL is extremely high on a ketogenic diet. And guess what? There's other people who are not only searching for it, might have even been browsing past it.
Right.
That's a modern phenomenon that we're now capable of truly enjoying, and for that matter, to help us advance. Okay, that's great. I then further share out this data. I keep pounding away at my research, and I'm providing more and more people are sending me back studies that seem to specifically discuss elements involved with those things I'm looking for in my research. Mm-hmm. Again, without getting into the mechanics, the more interesting thing that's happening here is we have basically crowd curation, as though I had basically a free research team. The more popular I can get on Twitter, and I think right now I'm at like 26,000 followers, something like that.
Right.
The more I leverage it in a way I know not a lot of people do, which is basically as my research machine, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
And it works great. It's leveraging a modern phenomenon. Well, what happened about 2 years ago is I started to realize there was kind of almost a combination lock to my energy model that could be expressed at the far end of the spectrum. By that, I mean a particular kind of hyperresponder that I was calling at the time lean mass hyperresponder.
Okay.
I called them lean mass hyperresponders because that was just observational, as in it seemed as if people who had these three different lipid things in common tended to be lean and or athletic, but usually both. And the three lipids that they had in common is they tended to have very high LDL cholesterol, very high HDL cholesterol, and very low triglycerides. LDL typically being 80 or higher, LDL typically being 200 or higher, HDL being 80 or higher, and triglycerides being 70 or lower. Mm-hmm. And that's very distinctive. It's just speaking one engineer to the next.
Right.
How crazy is it that I could look at the blood work of lipids in your blood, and from that say you are likely lean and or athletic? Your cholesterol test is telling me that's about a 90% chance that you are lean and or athletic, or probably both. That's what excites me. Another engineer could get that right away, but I say that to a medical professional and they're like, oh, yeah, okay. I'm going, no. That's homeostasis, man. That is something we would not, anyway. Yeah. So why is this so relevant to the topic I was just talking about? Because these lean mass hyperresponders that write this article, there was by that time enough people who were looking online at cholesterolcode.com. I put it out there, and I genuinely thought at the time I was doing it, I may be completely wrong. There could be a whole bunch of people who are like obese and sedentary that came forward and said, oh no, that's my profile. You're wrong.
Right.
It's not just lean people, right? Wrong. Actually, it exploded. It's the most commented on blog post to date. I want to say there's like 700 comments on that thing.
Wow.
And just people after people that were just coming forward going, that's me. I have that profile. And I just, I ran 2 marathons in the last month, and I'm a yogi, right? I'm an advanced yoga instructor. Oh, I am a huge cyclist, right? Mm-hmm. Blah, blah, blah.
Right.
Again, I didn't have to take out an ad in the New York Times. I didn't have to be some, professor that visited lots of different campuses and spent ungodly sums of money trying to collect this. No. I got to just put it out in 2017 in a blog post that got shared a lot, so that eventually this cohort would come to me. And then eventually I would make a Facebook group around this group. And now there's a lot of them that are inhabiting it, and they're sharing data amongst themselves, right? This was really only possible to this degree now. This is, if this was happening 20 years ago, nobody would know who I am. There's no question. Right. And I wouldn't have any idea if I was on the right track at all. I probably would have given up. Right.
Yeah.
And that's the power of keeping things distributed.
Yeah.
and providing the means to do so, but it's technology that unlocks that possibility. It's this thing we're doing. We're talking on Skype right now, face to face. Right. Like I could not have known where you were at all. I mean, I found out because I asked you at the beginning, but I've been interviewed before where I didn't know where the other person was based, and this was just possible to do it this way.
Sure.
There's some number of your listeners, I hope a lot, who've never heard this before, and if they've gone on a low carb diet and they saw their cholesterol go up, they go, "Oh, I want to know more about that. Oh, I don't have to go order Dave's book through the phone. I can just go straight right now to cholesterolcode.com and watch as many lectures as I want and find out right away." Right. That is why we're blessed. And that is why I do genuinely think that this is going to help save science.
And okay, so I'm going to tell you everything you just said about how that all started, and then get into how this podcast happened. Because back in January of last year, I was extremely unhealthy, like very high body fat percentage. I had all kinds of health problems, sleep apnea, chronic back pain. There's a ton of things, right? Pre-diabetic, all these things. And now I've lost 25% body fat in 14 months. And
nice. Wow.
Literally every single health issue I had has completely gone. Every single one. Okay.
What's your secret?
Okay. No. That's why it's just mind blowing when I see people like Julian Michaels. I'm just like, I don't care what you say. All I have is just what happened to me. That's all I can tell you. Okay. Whatever you want to tell people or believe, that's fine. So anyway, so I went through all this, and about 6 months into my kind of journey with this way of eating, I said, man, I feel better than ever. I'm not taking any more medicine. In a few months, I'm going to go get retested for sleep apnea and see if I've gone. I used to be on a machine and everything, So I said, okay, let me go get some blood work done because I haven't had that done. Right. So I go get the blood work done, and it was a standard lipid because I didn't know any different, I didn't know about like NMRs and particle size or any of those things at the time. So basically, I got it, and my doctor, who was just my regular doctor, he saw it and he said, this is, he basically thought it was very bad. Right. And essentially it was a lean mass hyperresponder profile. Okay, now then I know that, but essentially that's what it was. So I said, man, I don't know how I can be unhealthy. Everything about me is getting more healthy, right? It just seems crazy to me that I'm supposed to go on a drug. So I said, all right, so let me go research this, right? Essentially your story, just a tiny version of it, right? So I went and researched it, and my research was, low triglycerides, high HDL, and I came across your work on YouTube, actually. And I watched one of your lectures from like last year, and I said, oh, this makes a lot of sense to me. In my head, I said, oh, this makes total sense, like what he's talking about, right? From an engineer perspective. So I said, I have to find a new doctor. I said, that's the answer. I said, I have to find someone who knows about this, who is on the cutting edge of modern science and not based in their stuff on epidemiology studies from 50 years ago, right? So I said, all right, well, so I looked up and I found a doctor who is 90 minutes from me drive, okay? And that is Dr. Eric Sodikoff, you probably know. And,
yes.
So that's my doctor for the last 9 months or whatever, I say all the time. So basically, I found him, and ever since I established a relationship with him, it's been great because now everything I know or I read, I said, I want a doctor who knows more about this stuff than me. I want a doctor who's going to take his medical school knowledge, his experience with real patients, and then also be on the cutting edge of science, right? I want those three combined. And I found it. And to me, in 90 minutes is nothing it's like a unicorn, really, to be honest with you. If you look at the amount of doctors who are like that, it's a very small amount. So I actually have someone I know who flies in to see him. So it's pretty unique that way. So saying all that, that's how it comes full circle to this conversation, and how I started putting it together. I said, wow, there's all of this work being done that like the mass doesn't really know about, the mass population. And I think this could be a good segue into maybe our last topic. Actually, there's like 2 more questions I wanted to ask. So the one question is, if we can real quick compare hypothesis-driven testing, right? So you have a hypothesis, you're trying to prove it and or disprove it, right? And what are the techniques that you use to do that? And let's maybe talk about parallels to engineering and software development and product development. So I'll kick it off real quick, and that is to say, for the folks who are into product development out there, you may be familiar with some lean startup and lean UX concepts. And those are of the concept of an MVP and hypothesis-driven development. And essentially, for those who aren't familiar, that is when you have an idea that users want something, or you have an idea that this is going to make some money or save you a certain amount of money, right? What is the simplest thing you can do to go test that hypothesis? And what kind of metrics are you going to use to test it, right? And that is pretty different than the way that waterfall and other things have worked, where it's like we do all this analysis for 9 months, and we just interview people and we figure it all out, we write it all out, and then we go deliver, and that's what everyone's going to want, right? It's a different way of working. So even at a initiative level, let's say you had an idea that might take 2 years if you were going to do all of your idea, right? For a few teams to work on. Could we do something in 2 weeks that would go test part of that hypothesis as true or false?
Yes. But look,
yes.
If there's anything that you think is going to take you 2 years to test,
right?
Think harder.
Yes. Right. Yes. Because
odds are you can find a way to learn something about it. Is exactly what you said.
Right.
Look, this is why, like I'll share that I'm straddling two worlds right now. I have enough name equity that there's some engagement on the academic side to work with me on doing like some clinical trial stuff, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
Which is very exciting. I'll concede, but at the same time, and I'm an open book about this.
Yep.
It's mind-bogglingly slow because, again, I do feel like they're in waterfall world. Mm-hmm. I feel like there's usually a bit more process, and they're used to the process. They're used to that just being part of the gears. And the irony is I'll say, God, I wish we could be doing this faster. And oftentimes they're like, I don't know what you're talking about. We're going like lightning speed. You don't even realize how fast this has been going.
Right.
But it's because for me, yes, there's this running joke about engineers that it's only a matter of time until we say, forget it, I'm just going to go get it myself, right? That's how I've been about my own data. That's how I've been about my own experiments. If there's a way in which I could do a trial of something and it turns out that would take a year, I go, okay, now can I just do a smaller trial? That would take me a month. Okay. Right. Is there another way I could like bite it off a little bit smaller to where it's like a week? Right.
Right.
And that's worth putting thought into because it's hypothesis forming. Maybe it is rougher, but you can help to, as they say, correlation is not causation. Right. However, a lack of correlation can help you disprove causation. Okay. So you try to power things enough to at least find out if you're on the right track. Right. So I'm not just trying to prove something. Arguably, I'm on a mission to disprove my lipid hypothesis, my lipid energy model, I guess you could say. Yes. So I've sought to take steps. One of my favorite tricks that I'm doing right now, if you want to call it a trick, I'm genuinely offering a reward. I have a $3,000 budget right now. Okay. Where I'm going to pay $1,000 for any study that's shown to me that's not a drug or gene study, just normal human people, just a swath of human people, where we see high levels of cardiovascular disease with high levels of LDL cholesterol, so long as they also have high HDL and low triglycerides, like lean mass hyperresponders. Right. Now, I've been able to find studies that show the opposite, that you have low cardiovascular disease if you have low triglycerides and high HDL, even if you have high LDL. Right. So it's not that I'm trying to be flippant. I genuinely want to find if there's some evidence out there that could help disprove this, because this is part of my energy model. Part of my energy model is if your triglycerides are low and your HDL is high, you probably have a properly functioning lipid metabolism. Yeah. But here's the catch. The catch is I'm not a researcher by trade. Mm-hmm. And therefore, what can I do to accelerate it? Well, I could just take money out of my own pocket and wave it and say, I'll give you a reward if you're a better PubMed searcher than I am.
Right.
Here are the conditions. I could try to like pay a researcher to do this, but if they don't come up with anything, then that's not going to be as useful to me. I'll just set the standard and put it out there. Right.
Right.
And that's another way by which I found that I could test my hypothesis by just, putting money on the line without necessarily me being able to do anything with it. Now, I'll just advance a little bit further. I'm also trying to get access to existing data sets that are out there that would have that data. For example, Women's Health Study, Pure. There's a number of these that are very large and might have that strata, those three in common.
Right.
But again, the gears of academia are slow.
So maybe, Dave, real quick, we can talk about, let's get into this real quick, because we talked about hypothesis-driven development. You have a hypothesis, you go and actually test it using real metrics, right? And it is not an associative study. It's like actually looking at what is happening, what is the data telling us, what are we wrong about, what could we be wrong about, and always looking. In fact, that's something I coach is, when we're thinking about what leading indicators to use to determine if we're on the right or wrong path in our hypothesis, right? How can we design these leading indicators in such a way which it will likely potentially disprove our hypothesis? It's the inverse of setting yourself up for success, right? Because you could probably easily set those leading indicators and metrics up to always prove yourself right. A lot of times you can put a range or something which is going to prove yourself right, and then you go, aha, and then you post it on Twitter or a blog post or whatever, right? So that is very easy. So I'm paralleling software development and product development to this. So maybe we can talk about what most of our current thinking, even around the world at this point, it's not just the United States, it's pretty much worldwide. And that comes from more associative studies, epidemiology, and here's my view, and Dave, I'm going to ask you to chime in right after I say this. I'm thinking that an epidemiology study is really good for developing a hypothesis, to potentially good for developing a hypothesis to then go actually do the real testing, not necessarily use the epidemiology study as the actual test. Does that make sense? Like
that's exactly right. Yes. And
go ahead.
Look, I've heard it put this way by a few different people, and I can not state it strongly enough. Epidemiology is useful for forming a hypothesis.
Right.
Hey, I'm observing this pattern, and this pattern does seem to suggest that maybe this could be causing that.
Right.
Right. Now, there's in talking about this, there's something known as the Bradford-Hill criteria. He was a fairly famous epidemiologist, and I want to say he gave this speech like 60 years ago, something like that, where basically he said, okay, I have these 9 assessments, and these 9 assessments will get closer to meeting an epidemiological way of feeling like you've met causation, while still conceding that it's not really the gold standard of causal association that we would hope to see, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there are some that will say, oh, okay, so we can, with epidemiology, basically determine if something is causal. It's worth, by the way, for anybody who's listening to this to actually check it out. It's actually kind of interesting, but the problem is that, like many other things, that then started getting watered down to where a number of people would say, well, this basically meets Bradford-Hill criteria, therefore this causes that.
Right. Yeah.
I'm quite frankly a bit frustrated when people not only pull epidemiology out as hey, this is associated with that and therefore this causes that, but Bradford-Hill himself wasn't even interested in things that had a relative risk multiple of 2 or less. In other words, even if something was twice as likely to happen in one population than another, that was not even just the beginning of the conversation.
Right.
You need to get well beyond that. Something like smoking, where you're looking at 2,000 or 4,000 times as a multiple, right? I think one of his favorite examples was the chimney sweepers. There was a a particular disease that was associated at 300 times the rate for people who happen to be chimney sweepers. They didn't know what it was. That was the actual mechanism, but that seemed to be pretty, striking as a possible causative thing, right?
Right.
That I would be totally comfortable saying, I don't know that chimney sweeping causes this problem, but I don't want to do chimney sweeping because of knowing this association.
Right.
What I don't want is I don't want policy being made and enforced onto me from an association that's far weaker.
Yep.
That's, oh my God, the red meat causes cancer, maybe one of my favorite examples of one of the weakest associations observed. I mean, just incredibly, I think it's like 18%, and it's because it was comparing 5% in the control population to 6% in the, I don't even know if I can say intervention because it wasn't really an intervention study.
Yeah. No,
and the problem is again, this is the problem with epidemiological studies. You're looking at a group that already probably has something known as healthy user bias. People who were not eating red meat proactively were like you and I growing up in the 80s and 90s where they were saying skip the steak and have a salad because it's healthier for you. Therefore, they probably had other habits as well that tended toward leaning towards healthy user behavior.
Right.
So you have to control for that. How do you control for that? By doing an actual randomized clinical control trial. And unfortunately, you need a nice lifelong experience for people to do that. You can't do that. You can't get, like, say, people in two different groups to live 20 years eating basically the same diet with only one interventional difference.
Right.
So again, good hypothesis forming. It's fun to chat about it, but I really dislike when people take that as causal.
And for the folks listening, you might be able to relate to this. You ever turn on the TV and one day you see that coffee's going to give you cancer. The next day you see that coffee's going to help you never get cancer. The same thing with how eggs are bad for you one day. Then the next day they're good for you. Then the next day they're bad for you. All of those studies are all epidemiological associative data. And none of them are randomized controlled trials. None of them are actually how the mechanics of the things work in your body. They're just all looking at paper and saying, hey, if you look up some associative studies, there's some funny ones out there. I think there's one about the amount of Nicolas Cage films.
Yes, I know what you're talking about.
So there's like a study that's
in a pool or something like that.
There's even one that says the amount of Nicolas Cage films in IMDb per year correlate with the divorce rate in Massachusetts.
Right.
So something like that. That's one of them. There's a bunch. But the point is, you could look at that and say, and then you would have a tab, like basically a headline. And the headline would say, we got to stop making movies because people are getting divorced, right? Or whatever. That's what that associative data would say. It's totally ridiculous.
Nicolas Cage is personally causing a high rate of divorce by making movies.
Yes.
He feels ashamed of himself.
And then to think how ridiculous that is, to take that and then for the government to say, yeah, this is the way you should be. We should no longer be doing Nicolas Cage movies. Like, it's just like all logic is thrown out the window. Anyway, so that's just me ranting a little bit. But that's the difference between associative data studies, epidemiological studies, and we're talking about actual scientific studies, which are hypothesis-driven, which are using controlled trials, randomized controlled trials, also even better, or maybe not better, but there's different approaches, looking at a microscope of what's happening when you introduce certain things into your body, and how your cells reacting to it. I'm even thinking of Ivor Cummins' talk on the glycocalyx, right? And he had a fascinating, some fascinating slides on the effect of inflammation or sugar, for instance, on your glycocalyx. And I don't want to get that. We could go down a rabbit hole on that one. But I will say this, stuff like that to me is pretty fascinating. And that's not just associates. That's people that's engineers or biologists, or I don't know exactly who's doing this type of work, but they are doing things under a microscope, seeing what's actually happening when A happens and B happens, like causal things. So to me,
but even that has lots of problems because what you're describing is known as in vitro studies.
Okay.
You still don't have the benefit of a native system. So
sure.
You get some cells, you culture them, you do things to them, and you can kind of elucidate some mechanisms.
Right.
That said, that still has some issues, right? Because, you don't have the same blood flow, you don't have the same responsiveness from other organs that might change the dynamics of the serum, lots of things along those lines. But it's true. It helps when you can have them all together. When you can have, we observe this in nature. We see that it's associated across. One of the things that's another good Bradford Hill criteria is it applying to everything, right? Like, are you, and the lipid hypothesis is one good example. I point this out all the time, is if you believe in LDL causing atherosclerosis, which is the buildup of plaque in the arterial wall, you would, of course, say this should be applying to every population of every age, of every ethnicity. It doesn't. Right. So it seems as if that there's a lot of context to bear in mind. Let's figure out that context rather than just fighting over the more simplistic marker itself.
Right. So I have one last question, Dave. One last question. And that is, now that you are the engineer who's involved in lipidology, and you have been doing knowledge and creative work your whole life when it comes to software development, I'm thinking you would be the best person to ask for this. Is there a certain type of lipid panel? This is an outside of the box question, but is there a certain type of lipid panel which might lend itself to potentially higher performance in this type of work? And here's what I'm getting at. Like, for instance, if you said, hey, my lipid panel came back and my trigs are out, like 1,000, right? Or 2,000 or 500 or some very high number, right? Or conversely, my LDL is 70, right? Or I'm just throwing random things out there. And the answer could be absolutely not, Troy. That's a ridiculous question. And that's also fine. I just wanted to ask a totally outside of the box question and see what you think about that.
Well, I think I may have kind of an answer to that, which is when I was first getting into this, the only test I got over and over again was it's called a nuclear magnetic resonance test. It's an NMR. Mm-hmm. That's an advanced lipid test because it breaks out all the different particles. So it'll tell you your particle count. It'll tell you your small LDL particle count. It'll even break out the different subfractions. Mm-hmm. Well, the reason I bring this up is I thought that I would forever want that to be the only test I get. And granted, it has been the only test. It's the one test you can count on every single one of my blood labs having, and I have 113 of them since I started this.
Right.
That said, I'm now of the mind that it's really not as useful as I would have thought.
Okay.
The reason is that HDL and triglycerides basically tell the story of what your particles would probably look like. There's only one key exception, which is when your LDL is low and your particle count, your LDL particle count is high. So let's say that you did have an LDL of 90, but you had a particle count of, let's say, 1,400.
Okay.
That would be concerning to me. However, I will probably never see that guy. He'll never come to cholesterol code.
Right.
Because that person, when they got that lab, that heard from their doctor, this looks great. Keep up the good work.
Yeah.
And then they're out the door.
Yeah.
So probably that same person has really high triglycerides or has very low HDL or both.
Okay.
In which case, then I could say, yeah, we could go ahead and do a follow-up test. But you know what? I already know you're going to have a high propensity for small, dense LDL particles. And I would be uncomfortable if you were a family member of mine for having that, because that's known as atherogenic dyslipidemia.
Right.
That has a high association with cardiovascular disease.
And there's also some work out there involved thinking about what they call type 3 diabetes, which is Alzheimer's, but that's like that's a whole nother avenue that's pretty much outside the scope of this. But I think some of those, if you have very high trigs, for example, and maybe even if you had high trigs, low LDL for a long time, maybe that could be, I'm not saying that's a cause, but I'm just saying that might be concerning for even that, to think, okay, maybe there's some cognitive impairment potential. There's a lot of things we don't know, as I think, or there isn't really settled science on. That's my opinion. And I think it's worth exploring. And that's why I've had you on the podcast. So I wanted to thank you for your time, and I wanted to give you some time to promote whatever you like.
Well, the single biggest thing I want to promote is, even if you're not a big fan of the low carb diet, please see a little bit of my research before making a lifelong medical decision off a single cholesterol test.
Yes.
Like if there's any headline message, I try to get that out there, because unfortunately I know of many stories that with the typical caveats, I'm not a medical professional and I'm not giving medical advice, et cetera. Please be aware of how dynamic these numbers are. Please be aware that so many of these things have changed very rapidly, given once you kind of understand it well enough. So that's obviously important. Yes, of course, we have not only a lot of responding that we do at cholesterolcode.com, but as I was just talking to you about offline a little bit earlier, I'm actually putting together a more responsive app, web app, that'll actually be on there for people to be able to do analysis on their numbers. So a lot of the patterns and the opinions we give on those patterns will all be baked into that code and will be available at our site. So that should be available somewhere on the front page.
Beautiful.
And of course, you can find me at Dave Keto on Twitter. But I'm really glad we got to talk. I'm really glad we got to talk about process, and for that matter, why it is we got to how we got here. Because I really do think, just like waterfall eventually becoming deprecated, it just took us doing it the wrong way for a while.
Right.
Yeah. Eventually stop doing it the wrong way. And I think this is going to be one of those things.
And I'll say this, Dave, going back to waterfall, you would think that the government would be the very last people to get involved with Agile, right? You would think that, right? But it's funny that I hear more and more stories about government agencies going through Agile transformations now. Now, it has been 20 years or whatever since Agile, but they're eventually coming around. Okay. So that gives me hope. That's all I can
still hope.
Yeah. So anyway, well, thanks again. You can reach me at G4S Troy on Twitter, and we have a free coalition, which is coalition.agileuprising.com, where you can go and kind of engage, and there's other people in the Agile community there, and for free. Everything's free. There's no cost, no promotion or anything. So you can go there. If you have any questions about any of this stuff or Agile or whatever, you can go there. So again, do you have a Patreon or anything like that, Dave?
Yeah, although probably what's easier for people is just go to cholesterolcode.com/members.
Okay.
Sorry, cholesterolcode.com/register.
Register. Okay.
To become a member.
Okay. All right. So that's going to be on my list. I'm going to do that, Dave. So
all of our research is individually funded, and that's been by design. I've actually wanted to do this strictly without any affiliates or companies paying for anything, really.
Right. Okay. Very good. Well, thanks again, Dave. This has really been a pleasure. I'm excited. I'm excited to see what the response is going to be, and really maybe even Agile community and kind of the low carb community. So thanks again.
Thanks for having me.